You have something very, very specific in mind that you want, but you're struggling to find it. We were on the hunt recently for a new dining room table in our family. And we like our old one, but the position of the legs underneath means that when we have more than sort of 4 or 5 people around, unless you really like bruised knees, you won't have that much of a nice time at our house. So the hunt began, and at one point we were dreaming, Ali was dreaming, of a bespoke table that would perfectly fit into the space in our dining room. And we had a friend of ours who does that sort of thing, but we quite quickly realised he was out of our price range. He's very good at what he does. And so we couldn't realise the dream that way. We then inquired with my mum's husband, and we said to him, could you build us a table, maybe just slightly cheaper than our friend would want to build it? And he agreed. He started to go away, started to plan, but then we reflected and we sort of said, actually, do you know what? It's not really fair on Duncan to ask him to do DIY every time he comes to our house. So we said, don't worry, we'll just get you to put some shelves up instead. We'll let the table slide. So we started looking online, and nothing quite took our fancy there. Ali had a look around shops, still nothing. Nothing was quite right until one day the Lord provided. One day Ali logged onto Facebook Marketplace, and there right in front of her at the top of her feed was the table she'd been dreaming of for many months. I was in the living room, I heard, Tom, I found it. Look at this. A couple in the church have just put this up for collection. It's perfect. It's all I've ever dreamed of in a table. It's exactly what I was dreaming of. Please, can you go and get it now? Just take apart the table we've got. I don't care what's going on. I don't care the kids are eating their dinner. Take it apart, get it out, make space for the new table. That was a slight exaggeration, but she arranged for me to go and collect the table. I brought it back, I assembled it in the kitchen, we moved out the old one, and we just stood there, and I kid you not, I looked over, and one of the biggest smiles I've ever seen on Ali's face. Like, Jen, you look at our wedding photos, and you looked at her at that moment, like, comparable levels of joy as this table was in. Why? Because she'd finally found what she was looking for. In 1 Samuel this morning, we're going to see a contrast. We're going to see a contrast between what Israel are looking for and what God is looking for. As we've said in the previous 2 books, as you heard in the video there, we join the story in the story of the Bible in a moment of chaos, where chaos is just reigning, but God in the midst of it is committed to working out his plan and promise. And we see the title character of this 2-part book, Samuel, and we're going to look at 1 Samuel this morning, we're going to look at 2 Samuel after Easter. We've got 2 special offering messages next week and then Easter Sunday, which I hope you're all still very excited about. Although apparently not many of you are here. That's quite frustrating as well. I know, like, come on guys. Finally got one on and none of you are here. But it's going to be a great time. And Samuel, the title character, he's sort of a mix between the last judge in the period of the judges and the first prophet who then serve alongside the kings of Israel. And Samuel really is battling with the people on what they desire, their desire for a king. Samuel urges the people, he says, guys, keep God as your king. Don't seek after the kings like the other nations around you have, but they want their man. The people are adamant that they want a king like the other nations. And so God, in conversation with Samuel after this, they're talking to one another, and God just says to Samuel, give the people what they want, but give them a warning from me as you do so. I don't know if you've ever been around young kids when they're in their inquisitive phase. You know that sometimes the best way for them to learn is to give them what they want, even though it's maybe a foolish thing for them to have or not the best thing for them. When I was younger, I remember asking my dad one evening, Dad, please could I try some whiskey? And so initially after he said no, I must have only been about 10 or 11, I pestered him a little bit, and eventually he said yes. I thought, wow, didn't expect to have a breakthrough that quickly and easily. So off he went, came back with his Jack Daniel's branded glass with whiskey in it. And safe to say, after one very small sip, I was spitting it back out and agreed with him that no, it was disgusting, it wasn't good for me. And this doesn't undermine the point I'm trying to make. Only later on in life did I find out it wasn't whiskey. In fact, it was cooking oil that he'd put in the glass. But the point remains, sometimes we're given what we think we want so that we understand for ourselves why we shouldn't have it. And God tells Samuel to give the people a king, but to warn them as he does so that if they want a king like the other nations have got, that's exactly what they're going to get. He says the king that you wanted is going to enlist your sons in his army, and many of them will die. Or the ones that he doesn't put in the army, he's probably going to make his servants, and they're probably going to be fairly poorly looked after and exhausted by his demands. He's going to take your daughters and he's going to turn them into his servants. He's going to take your land and rob you of the best of your harvest. He's going to take your animals, your livestock, and take the very best of them as well. Life under this king is not going to be enjoyable like it could be with me as your king. But again, the people just say, bring it on. We want a king like the other nations. And this morning we're going to unpack this story of how Israel is given the king that it wanted, and then they're given the king that God wanted. And we're going to compare the two options. And what we see is that the king that the people desire, the king like the one of the other nations, is of course a bad king. And he himself is corrupted and leads the people even further into chaos. And then we're going to see how God raises up his king and demonstrates that he is not only the king the people needed, but the one that God was seeking from the beginning. A good king, crucially, whose heart is for God. That's the fundamental difference between the king that the people want and the people that God eventually raises up for them. And 1 Samuel covers the life of this first king, King Saul. It covers a bit more at the beginning, but then we're introduced to Saul the moment he's anointed as king, and it takes us right the way through to the very end of Saul's life, and it's quite a tragic end at that. Part of the way through, as God removes his anointing, his favor on Saul, and he places it upon a new king, we're introduced to God's choice in David. And what we're going to see is that Saul, he leads a life characterized by pride, whereas David, again, as we heard on the video, is humble. Which is important to see because right at the beginning of the book, the bit before we're introduced to these two kings, we get a song that kind of foreshadows the theme of the whole book. It's sung by a lady called Hannah. Hannah is the prophet Samuel's mother, and we're told of just her horrible situation at the start of the book where she's being mocked by another one of her husband's wives. Again, just because it's there doesn't mean it's a good idea. But husband with multiple wives, but she's unable to bear him any children. And she's so distressed and desperate at this fact that when she comes to the temple and she's praying, the priest mistakes her for someone who's drunk and disorderly because she's praying with such anguish, so much emotion. And she cries out to God and she says, God, if you'll give me a son, I will give him back to you. If you give me the gift of a son, I will make him serve you for all his life. I'll present him back to you. Once the priest realizes that she's not drunk and she's just upset, he goes alongside her and he speaks a word of faith over her. He says, God has heard you and God will do as you've said. God's going to give you a son and he will serve the Lord all his days. So Hannah goes from this moment of deep anguish to a year later having a son, the son that she asked for. And we see this moment at the start of 1 Samuel chapter 2 where Hannah sings this song of delight. And really her song says that God has recognized me in my lowliness and he's exalted me. But actually it then kind of transitions prophetically into a statement of how God is going to deal with his people in this season. He's going to oppose those who are proud. And as we said, Saul, the people's king, that's his number one character trait. But he's going to raise up and exalt the humble. And we'll see more of humility when we get to David. But then also in Hannah's song, we get this promise that the Lord is going to strengthen his anointed king. And so we're introduced to this idea that we're to look forward to the Lord's anointed king as well. So let's look at them side by side. Saul and Paul. That was nearly happened. Saul and David. And we're going to look at how their key traits of pride and humility show up time and time again in their stories. First of all, let's look at Saul, man's proud king. We're introduced to him really as he's functioning as king in 1 Samuel 13. And there's a moment where Samuel the priest is meant to do the offerings. Saul is there to do many things, but he's not allowed to do the offerings. That's the role of the priest. And there's a battle that needs to be fought. And Samuel said, Saul, I'll meet you at this time, at this location before you go into battle, and I'll do the offerings for everyone. Saul is waiting in their agreed location, and Samuel maybe is showing up a bit late. Maybe he's like some of you. Maybe he likes a little lion, or he's just taking his time. He's popped to Starbucks on his way, and Saul's on time, and he's thinking, "Okay, guys, Samuel, I need you to hurry up. I need you to get here because I've got a battle that I need to fight. All the time you waste before you get here is time lost in battle." And in his nervousness, instead of waiting for Samuel to show, he does the offerings himself. Which might not seem that significant to us, but it's a very big deal. You remember in previous books, God's pretty precious about how the offering's done, and rightly so. And so for Saul to take these things into his own hand is just a gross statement of his own pride and his own desire to do it his own way. He says, "Oh God, I know this is how you like to do it, but I'm sure I'll get away with doing it differently just this once." And we're told later on in 1 Samuel 30, it's the first time that God says, I'm going to reject you, Saul. You reject me, I'm going to reject you. If you're not going to do things how I've asked you to do them, then I won't be with you, and I'll raise up another king for me whose heart is after my own. We see then in chapter 14, we get this weird scenario where Saul, he basically makes his soldiers, I don't know about you, if I was in my sort of Lord of the Rings daydreams, I'd love to be the kind of captain of an army one day. But Saul, when he gets this position, and then he says, hey guys, do you know what? I think a way to show our holiness, a way to show that we're really good soldiers is that I don't want you to eat a thing while the sun is still in the sky. I only want you to eat when the sun comes down. It doesn't really say why he does it. It's very strange. It's a strange tactic, I think you'd agree, if you're trying to win battles. Let's not give our soldiers any food in the daytime and let's ask them to just go and fight on an empty stomach. And so he does this, and he says, if anyone is going to eat during the day, then you're going to die. That's disobedience to me and therefore God, and you're going to die. And his son, Jonathan, who's one of Israel's best soldiers, just cannot help himself one day and just has a dash of honey in the middle of the day. The stuff starts to happen, and the battle starts to get lost, and they start to run into a bit of trouble. And so Saul says, okay, something must have gone wrong. Someone must have broken the vow that I made you all swear. And so I'm going to bring me and my son Jonathan, we're going to come and stand over here, and all of you lot are going to stand over there, and we're going to cast lots, which is like a holy game of Yahtzee. It's pretty cool. And it basically reveals that the person who God is with, they'll win the casting of the lots, and the person who is not, they'll lose. And that reveals who kind of is God's way of revealing some stuff sometimes. Not anymore. Don't do it when you play Yahtzee. That's weird. But what it actually reveals is that the sin, the fault is on David and Jonathan's side. And so Saul turns to Jonathan and says, what have you done? And he says, I might have had just a little lick of honey. And even at that point, when he realizes it's his own son who's been compromised by his silly rules, he can't help but see it through. He can't help but hang on to his pride. And he says, well, okay, Jonathan, that's it. You're going to have to die. And it's only his other soldiers who say, whoa, hang on a minute. Jonathan's one of our best guys, and he's your son. Surely you're not going to kill him over this strange rule. And they end up sparing his life. You see, he's silly. He's compromised. Then we see in chapter 15, probably one of the more interesting moments in Saul's life, where he wins this amazing battle against King Agag, and God commands him to win the battle comprehensively. He says, deal comprehensively with Agag and his forces, which basically means get rid of him. Like, don't capture him, don't take him as a prisoner of war, just get rid of him. What does Saul do? He spares Agag's life. He says, all right, God, I know you said that, but let's keep him alive. Come on, let's hang on to him. Oh, and let's hang on to some of his livestock and his cattle too. We don't want to put those things to waste, do we? No, we don't want to be wasteful. And so he rejects again God's way of doing things. He thinks he knows better, and he leaves Agag alive. And Samuel has to come along, and Samuel's pretty horrified that Agag's still alive, so Samuel cuts him up himself. Again, it's all a bit fun in the Old Testament, isn't it? And at that point, again, we just see that Saul is compromised. He almost gets there. He almost wins it comprehensively. He almost does everything that God's asked him to do, but he doesn't do the last little bit. And he compromises. And again, we recognized in Judges, didn't we, that we're in this period of time where God's people have compromised, and it's led them to a point of chaos. The kings are meant to come along and lead them out of chaos. The king's presence is meant to be a good thing, but he falls in exactly the same way as those who have gone before him. We then, in this spell of 9 chapters, 18 to 27, we get David, by this point, is on the scene. He's around, he's recognized, and people are starting to pick up on the hype around David. You know, he's the kind of prodigious talent coming through the youth academy. He's the one that everyone's kind of ready to get behind. You know, the whole thing of Saul killed in his thousands, but David in his tens of thousands. Like, this guy's the real deal. And Saul gets jealous. Rather than recognizing his own mistakes and the fact that the anointing's moved to David, he gets jealous and he says, I've got to get rid of this kid. I've got to wipe him out. And so those 9 chapters are basically this murderous pursuit of David. Many, many times he forces David into hiding. And even at one point, again, poor Jonathan, like, you would not want to be this guy's son, I tell you. Jonathan comes along and he struck up a friendship with David, and David's saying, I think your dad's trying to kill me. And Jonathan's like, no, he wouldn't do that. And they're like, okay, well, let's set up a little test and we'll just see what Saul's intentions really are. And the test that they set up reveals that Saul really is trying to kill David. But then when Saul realizes that Jonathan and David were sort of conspiring together to test him, he gets angry at Jonathan again, and if he wasn't such a rubbish throw, he'd have speared his own son against the wall for conspiring with David. That's how jealous he's got. That's how crazy he's got in his disobedience to God. Jonathan again gets away with it, Poor guy, honestly. You read through 1 Samuel, he's the one you feel most sorry for. And then the craziness sort of peaks in chapter 28. You get this, and this is like, you want weird Old Testament, read 1 Samuel 28, right? It's crazy. Saul casts out all the mediums, all the sort of people who dabble in witchcraft and things like that. He casts them out of the land. And then he kind of has this moment of realization where he goes, oh, do you know who used to be really helpful? Samuel. Samuel always seemed to have like a hotline to God. But unfortunately, by this point, Samuel's died. And so he has this moment where he's like, well, I can't speak to Samuel again. Maybe if I go and get one of those mediums that I've cast out, maybe one of them can chat, summon Samuel's spirit. And I don't know where you stand on ghosts. We can chat about it afterwards if you like. But this slightly strange thing happens where this medium comes along and says, okay, I'm going to awaken the spirit of Samuel. And Samuel's spirit is awakened and he starts talking to Saul and he's going, what are you doing? Like, God's rejected you. God's rejected you. Why am I kind of like, why am I here again? Like, why am I back? Why have you disturbed me kind of thing? And Saul is so desperate to kind of fix things, but in a way that he doesn't have to admit his own mistakes, in a way that he doesn't have to repent, in a way that he doesn't have to turn back from his ways. And so he ends up dabbling in all sorts of things that don't honor God. And essentially the story of his life, it ends in the very last chapter of 1 Samuel where he loses this horrendous battle, he loses his son Jonathan, he loses a load of people around him, and he ends up falling on his own sword, aka committing suicide, because he's just lost all hope in his own strength and his own ability. Pride catches up with him. Him rejecting God time and time again catches up with him. His pride causes him to reject God, so God ultimately rejects him. And I wonder how many of us, hopefully not in the events of Saul's life, I'd be very concerned about you if there's similarities that you recognize between how your week went and how Saul's life was. Like, don't murderously chase other members of the congregation around. Certainly don't try and go to the mediums in the New Forest anywhere. Like, just chill out. But maybe in our hearts and in our motives, maybe in our thoughts towards others, we do things that God has asked us not to do. We cower in fear at the calling that he's placed on us. We make silly promises that land us in hot water. We compromise. We get jealous. We get angry. And we dabble in stuff that's maybe not from God. Do the actions of your life speak to faith in God? Or might they reveal patterns of rejecting him and trusting in our own abilities, strengths, and decision making? I think if we're all honest, we see something of Saul's pride somewhere in our hearts, don't we? Hopefully not in outworking, but definitely in heart. And that's because that's what God is concerned by. In 1 Samuel 13, when God says, your kingdom, Saul, must come to an end. This is 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. Your kingdom must now come for an end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. It's not about the behaviors. It's not about the list of things that he's done in so much as what those things point to is that his heart is misaligned. That he's chosen pride, he's chosen independence rather than a life of dependence on God and humility before him. So let's turn then to our second king. When it becomes clear that Saul's pride has disqualified him, we see the rise and the beginning of King David, God's humble king. And we are introduced to him in chapter 16 as this lowly shepherd boy. Again, these stories are familiar to many of us, but it's helpful to go over them. 1 Samuel 16 is the moment where Jesse, David's dad, is contacted by Saul, maybe over the phone. No, probably not. And he says, right, I want you to get all your sons ready, and I'm going to come and visit you because I know that God's anointed king is among them. And so he lines up all his other sons, but he leaves David out in the field, doesn't he, tending to the sheep. He doesn't even consider him worthy of a call-up in that moment. He's too young, he's too junior, he's too inexperienced, he's the youngest. No one would ever pick him. But yet we know that, of course, David is God's choice. And we're introduced here as well to this idea of the shepherd king. Like Saul was very much an impressive military man. David is a shepherd. Why would we bring a shepherd boy and make him king of Israel, especially in a time where there's so much conflict going on? Well, it's again because God is concerned by David's heart. And God has appointed David for that moment precisely because his heart is for God. And so in the moments of potential for compromise, in the moments of difficulty, because his heart is right with the Lord, he's obedient. And he doesn't cower in fear like Saul does. And we see that worked out as we move to 1 Samuel 17, the story of David and Goliath. Again, arguably one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. And we see David's courage. we see that because his heart is aligned with God, he doesn't give a monkeys about what Goliath is saying. So you're a dirty Philistine. Take your God's name out of my mouth. Don't say that about my God. That's not true. I stand with God Almighty, Yahweh, and we'll win the victory. And also what we see, you hold up the sort of King Agag incident with the Goliath incident, and you start to see that David is quite literally succeeding where Saul failed because of his humility. Where Saul is called to win the battle comprehensively and kill the king convincingly, and then doesn't, David takes down Goliath with his stones and his pouch and his slingshot. But then when Goliath's fallen, what does he do? He runs over to the body and lops his head off for good measure. He deals uncompromisingly with the enemy. He doesn't take any chances. He goes the whole hog and does exactly what God has asked of him. And he leads the people into victory. And we see as well another fascinating comparison in his relationship with Jonathan. Saul is Jonathan's dad. He should be the most committed, most loyal person to Jonathan, and yet we see that his pride compromises their relationship. What do we see of David's relationship with Jonathan? This guy who in reality is a rival to his throne. He's the heir to the current king. If they wanted to play the birthright line, then it would be Jonathan who would go next. And so there should be some friction, but really what happens is David creates this incredible friendship based on loyalty to one another, based on commitment to one another. Why? Because he's not proud. He's not worried about competition for the throne. He's trusting that God will work out his plans and promises, and so he's able to see Jonathan for who he is, a potential friend, not a rival to the throne. And again, we read in 1 Samuel 20, just the depth of their friendship that they're able to create because David is humble before God. And then we see David's obedience. And I love, again, that for the wacky medium stories, you also get the kind of comedy stories as well, where multiple times as Saul is pursuing David and trying to take his life, you get these moments where Saul appears in a position of vulnerability, shall we say. There's a moment where Saul is marching around with his army. He says, guys, I really need a wee. I just need to pop off into this cave over here. And it just so happens he sticks his spear and his shield down and he goes for a wee against the wall. And it just so happens that David is up in this cave, hiding with his men that Saul is pursuing. And so his men say to David, they say, there he is, completely defenseless. Take him out. Take him out. And then all this can be over. You can go and sit on your throne in Jerusalem and we can, happy days. What does David do? Absolutely not. I'm not going to lay my hand on the one that God's anointed, even though by this point he's kind of not anointed. But that's God's king. His destiny's in God's hand, not mine. His life is not mine to take. Even when presented with an opportunity as good as that to end his suffering, to end his time in the wilderness and in the desert, he doesn't do it. Why? Because he trusts the promises of God. He's in a position of humility and he's able to say, okay, right, I need to check myself here. He might have been a little bit tempted. I'm sure he probably was. I'm sure the bow and arrow came up a little bit at that point, but he's humble enough to say, no, God, I trust you. I'm not trying to forge a path to power out of my own strength. I'm trusting in you. He exalts God and so is exalted by God. And you see this fascinating pattern of the two of them side by side. But more than just being a sort of inspiring example to us, David is much more than that. David is also a forerunner. He's a type of Jesus in the Old Testament. He's modeling something of the king that we will one day receive ourselves, the humble, chosen and anointed shepherd king. And that king is Jesus. I don't know if you've ever stopped to consider the way that maybe we read stories like David and Goliath might just be slightly off. You know, the sort of Sunday school reading that says, you're David and you've got some giants in your life that need slaying. You've got some things that are opposing you. And you know what? With God's help, you can take just a small stone and slay the giant in front of you. And that's okay. And if that's ever helped or inspired you, I'm not poo-pooing that at all. But I think that's not the main way we should read David and Goliath. The main way we should read David and Goliath, if we're going to put ourselves in the story, is we should put ourselves in the position of the fearful Israelites. We should put ourselves in the shoes of King Saul. We look at the enemy and we're petrified. We're helpless in and of ourselves. We need someone else to come along and slay the giant that stands in our way of the promises that God has for us. We need someone else who's going to fight the battle that there's no way we could win on our own. And that's exactly what Jesus does for us. He comes along, he slays the giant, He slays the devil. He slays the giant of sin and of death. He slays the giants of all that opposes us from being in the presence of God and being in relationship with God. And do you know what? That moment where David cuts the head off of Goliath, and then do you read what happens? The army then suddenly finds this incredible strength and this incredible courage and this incredible faith because they've seen what David has done on their behalf. And it says that they routed the Philistines. They went in and they won. That was one of the best days of their life. They won one of the best victories ever won. Why? Because the king had led them into battle in the way that he was supposed to. And it wasn't just that they looked at David and thought, oh, wow, isn't he amazing? They went, oh, he's right. God is bigger than their God. God is on our side. God has called us to do this so we can trust him and put our faith in him. We put our trust in Jesus as we recognize our Saul-like tendencies. But the beauty of Jesus is that he doesn't just call us to kind of remain in a place of adoration. You know, David doesn't just stop and then stand there and go, aren't I wonderful? They then go on the victory charge. And that victory charge involves them becoming more like David. It involves them becoming more courageous. It does involve them then following his example. Do you know, as we bask in the glory of Jesus, as we worship him like we've done this morning, the beauty of Christianity is that as we're surrendered wholeheartedly to him, remember that's what God's after. It's after our hearts, not after our behavior or our compliance. As we surrender to him, he's able to transform us and change us into those who are becoming like Jesus. We become followers of Jesus. We become mini Jesuses in the world, filled with the same spirit that he was filled with and that he left for his church. The church of Jesus is a people characterized by humility, should be characterized by humility. We should all be recognizing, hey, we haven't got what it takes. And that is a challenge to our pride, but you know, we get to agree with the promise as well that one day, just as as David exalts God and he himself is then exalted and lifted up, we too will one day be lifted up with him. He will give us strength. Following Jesus means trusting his perfection and then submitting to his example. And it means that by the power of his Spirit, we can be sober-minded and focused, not casual like Saul was. We can be courageous like David and like Jesus, not fearful like Saul was. We can be uncompromising, not compromising, just as Jesus and David were. We can be loyal to one another and to friends who aren't following Jesus. We can be obedient, not unfaithful. We do that by the power of his Spirit in us, not by our own strength. I just want to finish by asking, we started, the beginning of this morning by saying, have we found what we're looking for? And we can often ask the question, can't we, like, what is it that I'm looking for? I want to put it to you this morning that the more important question is not what are we looking for, but it's who is God looking for? Who's God looking for? And we're told in a sense that God's found what he's looking for. He's found his ultimate anointed shepherd king in Jesus. But Jesus as the king then turns to us and says, here's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for people after my own heart. I'm looking for people who will surrender themselves wholeheartedly to me and come on my adventure and come on the journey with me. I want to finish by asking you this morning, has God found what he's looking for in you this morning? Can you, with honesty and integrity, say that, yes, my heart is surrendered completely to Jesus? That there's no areas of my life where I might wander or drift into pride? I suspect the answer for all of us is no. I suspect for all of us, there's something in us that says, oh, but this area, this moment in my life, this battle that I'm fighting, this thing that I've always felt that I should do, this relationship that I don't want to surrender to God, these moments are all moments of us rejecting God. But God is on the hunt for those who would put their trust in his anointed king. And so I'd love us, just as Sam and Ross come back up, I'd love us just to have a moment of reflection. Don't worry, there's no altar call this morning that says, if you feel like Saul, come down the front and get prayer. But I'd love us just to stand, and I want us just to spend a few seconds reflecting on three things. I want us to, you can stand, sorry, the lack of clarity in every preacher. I'd love us to stand. Everyone just stays where they are. I'd love us to stand, and I'd love us just to close our eyes and just have a moment before God where we consider these three things. Just have a moment to reflect on the life of Saul that we've just explored. And just ask the Holy Spirit just to highlight anything in Saul's life that resonates with your own. Again, probably not behavior or action, but probably heart. Are there areas of my life where I'm rejecting God in order to follow my own way? And as you do that, I want you just to imagine that you're holding that thing or that situation or that moment. And the call of God is to lay that thing down. However hard, however heavy it is, however hard it is to lay down, God's call is to lay that down at the feet of Jesus. And then his call is to take your eyes off that thing and look up at him. To look up at the glorious shepherd king, Jesus. To look up at God's anointed. To look up at he who was humble beyond belief. He who succeeded where we failed. And to see him fully surrendered to the Father as our example. And I wonder what God is saying to you through the person of Jesus. For some of you, he's affirming his love for you. For others, he's calling you out into new seasons where your faith is going to be stretched and increased. For others, he just wants to put his arms around you. Say, thanks so much for giving that to me. But I wonder then for all of us, if we can just respond in this moment of worship. I'm going to sing a fairly well-known song and just say to God again, Lord, it's your heart, it's my heart that you want. So here's my heart. Here's my heart. Let's worship together.